3, 2, 1. Folks, well, once again, we are going to talk about coexistence with large carnivores, with predators on the landscape, topic we discussed many times. And this time, not only that, we're going to talk specifically about snow leopard. Maybe not specifically, but we get to that. And not only we're going to cover this topic, there's a new short film coming up titled Snow Leopard Trail. And the main person behind that film is the guest you already know from this podcast, the one and only Jonny Hanson. Jonny, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tommy. It's great to be back on. I think this makes it a hat trick of appearances on Tommy's Outdoors.
Exactly. I can't get rid of you. So for the folks, you've been first in episode 185 when you wrote a report about farmers' attitudes towards large carnivores. And then you were on episode 197 when you had a book out about coexistence with large carnivores titled Living with Lynx, for the reasons we discussed on that podcast. And now you're back because you have a film. So you're just stepping up things. You have a paper and the report in the press, and then you have a book, and now you have a film. I probably should have a film first and then the book, but anyway. Tell us, straight up, tell us anything we should know about the film, and most importantly, where people can view, and can they view right now? Do they need to wait? What's the story behind that?
Well, it's going to be premiering at film festivals in the last quarter of 2025 and then into 2026. Film festivals across Ireland and the UK and hopefully beyond that. But it's a 20-minute short. It's my first professional short film, and it's another way to turn complex topics and complex science, which underpins this. And in this case, unlike the book, which was underpinned by the report that we discussed on my first appearance, this film is underpinned by my entire PhD and all the now 7 publications that have come out of that. But the fact of the matter is that many people don't necessarily want to read academic journal articles. There is a place for that. They're a really important part of the scientific method and of advancing knowledge in both natural and social sciences. But part of that scientific method is that we strip out many of the things that make life worth living and make us fully human. And by that, I mean emotion and all of these things that are really important in our connection with the natural world. So my point is that this film takes all of the underlying science and it brings it to life with music and with characters and with beautiful landscapes and with all of those things that science alone cannot provide. But when we add that to science, when we create science and story together and we fuse them, then we create really powerful outputs and really powerful stories that can change who we are and change narratives.
Well, you mentioned professional film. Oh boy, professional it is. And the freaking landscapes, the footage there. It was, obviously, folks, I was, in a privileged position to view the screener. It was fantastic. Yeah, folks, go and see that film if you can. So let's talk about some things that were in the film specifically, and you were drawing so here's my observation, right? Maybe I put it this way, that when we talk about the book about the book, I said hey, you are really non-committal to the whether we like to introduce, because the book was specific, very very specific reality of Ireland and Britain, and one of my complaints maybe or observations was you're very non-committal, and you said well, I genuinely am. I'm not sure which way to go because there's all these complex factors and so on. But I think that you might be, I think I see through your game, because now you're bringing this beautiful film from Nepal, Himalaya, the exotic, charismatic megafauna, charismatic animals, the snow leopard. But it's not really about snow leopard, because you're drawing the parallels to Ireland and Britain all the time. So I feel like you're saying like, I'm not committal, I don't know, but then you bring in this beautiful thing and you're trying to inspire people and get people fired up about these carnivores, these apex predators. And so like, oh, by the way, folks, we could have that here, we could have lynx, and so on. So I'm curious about your response to this observation, but more importantly, what parallels can we draw and what lessons can we take from what is happening, what you witness and what you're talking about in the film to our backyard.
You're absolutely right that on the issue of large carnivore introductions to the UK and to Ireland, I still continue to have mixed feelings, but I do not have mixed feelings about large carnivores in and of themselves, and especially where they already exist and persist in landscapes. I feel strongly that we should redouble our efforts and the resources going into ensuring that those species never disappear from those landscapes, because my point is, once they disappear, it's really hard to bring them back, as we talked about at length in the last 2 episodes. So we should absolutely work really, really hard to make sure that there will always be snow leopards in the Himalaya and across the 2 million square kilometers of Central Asia and the 12 nations that they inhabit. At the same time, there are lessons that we can learn from living with snow leopards in places like Nepal from my Nepali colleagues, who we'll talk about more as we go through this podcast, that can help us visualize what coexistence might look like in Britain and Ireland. Because again, Tommy, because of that length of time that has passed since we last had large carnivores in these islands, it is very hard for the citizens of the UK and Ireland to conceptualize and visualize what that actually looks like. And I'm not talking romanticised David Attenborough documentaries where you see charismatic megafauna in quote-unquote pristine landscapes, completely untroubled by having to interact with pesky human beings and their pesky livestock and their pesky activities. I'm talking about the real world, where there are these messy continuums of natural and social, of wild and domestic, in which we as humans are, but also where we find large carnivores. And so we really need stories that articulate what that looks like. And that was part of my thinking behind creating this documentary, is to help us think, what does this look like? Because it's not, to summarize, it's not just that these species are extinct in our islands, it's that there is also extinction of experience. Our experience of living with these animals, our experience of farming with these animals have gone and vanished. So again, like with the book, the idea is to peer into what this looks like in another place. In the book, I went to places that were more similar to Britain and Ireland culturally and agriculturally, like North America and especially Western Europe. But there's also great value in going to places that are very different culturally, agriculturally, and geographically, to places like the Himalaya, and taking the wisdom about coexistence from places like that and applying it much closer to home.
Well, I'm going to follow up and I think that you're really would like to see them back, because you said something like, I think in the beginning of the film, that we need to relearn how to share landscapes with apex predators. Well, in Britain and Ireland, we need to relearn. I was like, whoa, that's a bold statement. Why would we need to do that if we're not, they're not here?
Well, yeah, and I'm quite happy to talk at length about this, because my own views are nuanced, hence the book and hence the film. I absolutely love the idea in principle. It's the practicalities, and particularly the long-term financing of coexistence on the time frame of landowning and lynx reintroductions that concerns me. Not over a 5-year pilot or a 10-year project, but over a century, Tommy, because that's the duration we need to be thinking about for lynx reintroductions. That's what the ecological modelling is being modelled on. But that's the timescale that farmers are on the land over multiple generations, tenancies, and even more so when land is owned. And it's that disconnect between short-term projects and long-term coexistence that concerns me in terms of the practicalities of making this work. And there's a need to really think through what that looks like, and to learn from places like Nepal, the good, the bad, and the ugly, about how that might work for us in the future. But the other point is that I do think it's going to happen. Even if I continue to have reservations and they're concentrated in what I just said there, I do think it is becoming more likely with every passing month and every passing year. So this is my contribution. That if and when it happens, then I think that we should make sure that it happens well and that we become a model of how to do it instead of a cautionary tale of how not to do it.
Yeah, that explains why we need to relearn. So you just want to prepare us for the inevitable.
Yeah, I do think.
Very good. Look, I would love this to happen in my lifetime. But like you said, I would love this to happen, in the right way, not causing a major, disruption and further division in a society. That's, I guess, it's a main thing. You mentioned your Nepali colleagues, and so please, maybe now is a great moment to talk about them and their work.
There are a couple of interesting trends that we unravel in this tale in Snow Leopard Trail. Some are very explicit and not subtle, like what can we learn from Nepal to take back to Ireland and to take back to Britain. But there is a subtle thread that we pull at, and it is this, that conservation, and you've talked about in some of your previous episodes with previous guests about this, has a troubling colonial legacy at times where often that so-called pristine nature, landscapes and national parks in the likes of Africa, Asia, but even the likes of Yellowstone, they often were created in response to a quite romanticized version of nature where indigenous and traditional people who hunted and fished and hunter-gathered were often forcibly removed from the landscape, and to create this often romantic Western notion of nature as somewhere that people were not, separate from wild things. And that fed through to, in more recent times, quite a top-down approach to conservation of fences and fines and fortresses, but also one where the West often sometimes imposed, sometimes it was necessary to provide capacity building and knowledge transfer to the global South in terms of upskilling in conservation. But still, I think at times there was this, we are the experts in the West and we will inform you in the global South. You need to conserve this. This is how you do it. And it felt a little bit patronizing at times. In this story, we invert and flip that narrative because we in the West, in Britain and in Ireland, but also across parts of Western Europe and North America, have had that extinction of experience. We have lost those species and lost the memory of living and farming with them. So in this story, I go to Nepal to learn from cultures and colleagues who have never lost these species and never had that extinction of experience, and take it back to inform our debates and discussions. So it's really flipping and inverting that tired trope that sometimes, but not always, can be present in conservation. And in this case, I go to visit my good friends and colleagues, Rinzin Lama, who's an award-winning, globally renowned conservation biologist, and then Tashi Argali, who is a nature guide. He's a fantastic photographer. Hopefully we can get his Instagram handle in the show notes as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Send it on. I'm just going to make a note to not forget.
I will indeed.
Yep.
And he's a hotelier. He's an entrepreneur. He's pioneering snow leopard tourism in Nepal, which is really the first person to do that in Nepal. You do get bits of it now in Mongolia and India. So these are really inspiring colleagues that I work with, and certainly within snow leopard conservation and my role with the Snow Leopard Conservancy, our role is resourcing and supporting people like Rinzin and Tashi. They are the guardians of snow leopard landscapes and the leaders of snow leopard conservation. Our job in the Snow Leopard Conservancy is to resource and support them and to bring their work to international attention as well.
Yeah, this is very important. Like when I was watching the film and then reflecting on my notes, like in the industry, in the tech industry, we have the saying that the expert is always a guy with a suitcase out of town. So it's like almost like he's always external. And I think a lot of that mindset is, like you said, in the conservation, is always someone from somewhere else comes in, and that's an expert. And a lot of that is just not true, especially in the places where, like I said, people are, never lost those animals. And absolutely, I just recently published an episode with a gentleman who used to be a park ranger in Africa, in South Africa, and he was talking that he was part of the group of the rangers who were coming to indigenous people living in the park area, and it was like, okay, no hunting now because we're conserving those animals. And I was like, whoa, that's like another episode. Like, podcast was about something else. It was like, whoa, that surely didn't go down particularly well with those people. Like, who, so, yeah, it's so like in Nepal, did they manage to avoid that situation where someone from outside comes in and tells them how to do, or was the element of that still present? And
well, I feel very qualified to answer that question because I've just published the final paper from my PhD, even though the data is now 11 years old, and it's on the governance of protected areas and the extent to which you include or exclude local communities. And Nepal went from a more exclusionary approach to, into the 2000s and the 90s, a more community-based and a bottom-up approach to conservation, where they would have had local institutions involved in co-managing protected areas. And certainly this part of Nepal, the Annapurna Conservation Area, is something of a case study across the world in that co-management of protected areas, in that there is an NGO and then there are lots of conservation committees within the communities in the protected area who together co-manage the park. But then because of the NGO, they're able to draw down quite significant funds from the likes of the UN and multilateral and international donors. It's not perfect. And certainly when I was there, I was exploring some of the tensions that were there when you peel back the curtain. They always are. But generally, and as we seek to conserve biodiversity across the world, trying to work with communities, especially when there are power dynamics between powerful conservation interests and local communities, it's really important to bring in the likes of social science, and especially social science that is attuned to power dynamics, and to navigate those very carefully. Because as Rindin points out in the film, talking about local communities that they are part of and work with, he says this is their land. These are the guardians of these landscapes. They've been here practicing some version of conservation for much longer than conservation has been a thing, in that we've inherited from the Victorians I'm going to use the term Western scientific, quote unquote, Western scientific approach to conservation. But indigenous peoples have been practicing some version of that for millennia. And I think, again, bringing together that scientific aptitude with those values, as Rinzin and Tashi do in that work, I think there's much that we can learn from that in that approach without romanticizing that approach either.
What's the NGO?
It's the National Trust for Nature Conservation, the NTNC. So it works across Nepal, but they have a particular role in the Annapurna Conservation Area, which is huge. The Annapurna Conservation Area is 7,000 square kilometers. So that's half the size of Northern Ireland. So it's a big place. And yet, in a place that we think of as, again, pristine, quote unquote, there are 100,000 people and 100,000 tourists visiting every year. So again, in this, the subtle thread in this story is helping us to understand what coexistence looks like when you have people and predators sharing landscapes, and all of the tensions and trade-offs that necessitates.
Shout out to people from environmental NGOs. I just want to say that because they're doing important role. And on top of that, I was recently accused of parroting far-right bashing of NGOs. So that's not the case. That's not the case. Always, for the good NGO work. I'm not giving them free pass on everything, but like you said, if they're working with the local communities and doing good work, that's where we need more of that. Listen, so on that subject, I want to ask you about this dynamic, because you mentioned money. They raised a lot of money. I think like involvement of people from the West or maybe like from the rich North are bringing these funds, right? So one of the things that struck me while I was watching film is one of your colleagues, one of your Nepali colleagues, said that he walked us through his, how he started, and that he had a trail cam, and that he saw the photos of the snow leopard, and that kind of hooked him. And now he does have number of 14 or something trail cams. And that struck me like, 14 trail cams. That's nothing, right? For like other research projects, like you can have, 140 trial. So clearly, at least that was what I took from this, like, okay, these things that we taking for granted and are like not a problem, in this reality, there are valuable resources and valuable assets, and they need to be careful with that. So I'm curious of your comments. Did I get that right from the film? Because that might be just my impression, or is it really, like if you do the research in Britain, for example, you don't have to deal with the problems, financial or equipment access to equipment even, that is much more challenging when you're in Nepal, in Himalaya.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is more challenging. Any sort of logistics, and my word, the logistics, if there was a making of this film, the behind the scenes, 3-4 days of travel to get to the field, 2 days in a Jeep on roads with plunging drops that go down hundreds of meters into raging torrents. And if the car slips by 3 feet, you're toast. So logistics of mountain environments, especially in the greatest mountain range on earth, are always going to be challenging. And that's part of the reason why working with snow leopards is challenging for any sort of filmmaker or for even conservationists who are living in those communities. And that can extend to then the sourcing and placing of trail cameras. In Tashi's case, it's more, there is some there's sensitivities about who owns the data. So there's a separate camera trapping program run by the NGO, and then Tashi is in a unique position of running his own separate study with his own resources, because he's an entrepreneur and is doing very well for himself with his hotel. But then he also would get some support from the Snow Leopard Conservancy. So it's perhaps a more nuanced tale. There's funding from different sources involved, and Tashi's own and Rinzin's just phenomenal entrepreneurial and innovative bent at work here as well.
Excellent. Good to hear that. Good to hear that those people are doing well. We need that. Listen, I just want to pick out on tourism. Okay. Because you mentioned, because this is something, and this is again, whether we're talking about Nepal and snow leopard, whether we're talking about Europe or Ireland or Britain, there's always this thing like, tourism that will create additional sources of income, that will, we often hear like, farming is becoming, unviable or very hard. Like people are not taking up on farming, then moving away. So that will support or revive rural communities, even with tourism and so on, right? So this is like, again, parallel that has in two places. When I I was immersed in this beautiful footage and the landscapes, and folks, I can't recommend enough to watch this film. It's a great sound. This was another thing. Like I like how the sound worked with the visuals, and so folks, if you're watching at home, put the headphones on. If not, it's just great. Anyway, so I was watching these beautiful landscapes, and then there was a quote that snow leopards or the wildlife can become an asset that people come to see. And one question is like, well, is that even true, right? Who saw? So did you saw a snow leopard eventually?
No.
Yeah, right.
I've never seen a snow leopard.
And exactly, and like I always say, look, it was like you've been very close in a film. But I spoke with the scientist who was working on lynx, I think, for 14 years or something, and he never saw one. No.
That makes me feel a lot better.
Yeah,
That makes me feel a
yeah.
lot
It was
better.
it's no, sorry. He worked on 14 years on lynx, and he saw it only once when he was driving with family, completely not related to research anything. They don't even looking, and he caught a glimpse of it. It's like that was one. So, and you know we know about examples that just knowing that they're out there might bring tourists because you have a hotels that have a lynx logo on top of that, and so on. But my thought is different. Like, do we really want to bring a lot of tourists into this pristine, beautiful landscape? Right? It may be kind of defending itself because it's kind of like hard to get, and it's like, you know, uncomfortable, and it's far away and remote and so on. But ultimately, the point that remains the same is the making wildlife a commodity that people comes in, because then, you know, it's a clear, like, the more tourists comes in, the more money we have, the more value we have on these animals. And at some point it's like, whoa, are we not degrading the environment? Are we not destroying the whole thing we set out to preserve because we now bringing all those tourists and all, you know? So curious of your comments, you know, specifically related to Nepal and a situation there, but also more broadly when we hear this argument being brought about the tourism and so on.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tommy, and it is one that has so many nuances and aspects to it. There are many shades of grey in the tourism and large carnivores, and there are, of course, issues that are site specific. And one of those for Annapurna is that, yes, 100,000 tourists can have a significant impact. And for instance, in the time between me being there and doing my PhD fieldwork 2013, 2014, and then going back in 2023 to film, they had finished completing a road around the eastern part of the massif, which joins a road around the western part. And then they don't meet because there's a 5,500 meter pass that just doesn't make sense to put a road over. But that is there primarily because of the people. The local people want access to resources and services. So this is one of the challenges. I know I was waxing lyrical about the importance of including local communities in protected area management, but that inherently leads to trade-offs and tensions between conservation goals and between development goals. And win-wins are a pretty elusive beast. They might even be more elusive than snow leopards or lynx. Tommy, there are always then the tensions between those that have to be navigated. So absolutely, I've seen that firsthand in the Annapurna region. And if I was wanting a 3-week trekking experience and a once-in-a-life opportunity, I would not do the Annapurna circuit, because you'd be walking on a road with cars and jeeps going past you, motorbikes. Now I would do the Manaslu circuit, which is next door and does not have a road around it. So you're absolutely right to point to those sort of things. Having said that, when it comes to snow leopard tourism, there are the thinking behind the research that we did during my PhD and the ongoing work that Tashi and Rinzin are doing is that it is so iconic and is one of the world's great hikes. And it was the first 8,000 meter to be climbed by Maurice Herzog in 1950. So you get a lot of French people. He was French. A lot of French people in coming to Annapurna. They seem to think it's theirs in the same way that the Brits think Everest is theirs, even though it was a Kiwi and a Nepali who first climbed it. But let's not go there this time. The thinking behind the research we did on tourism is that there are 100,000 tourists coming anyway. So how can we make better links between them and snow leopard conservation we did some research where potentially people could pay like a snow leopard conservation surcharge and try to raise money in that way, but also that they could go with the likes of people like Tashi and check camera traps or see a documentary, that the snow leopard be part of the brand more than it has been, and using it as a charismatic megafauna brand for the region. Because, and I'm convinced of this, and I've probably published more and done more research on this than anyone else in this region, looking at what locals think about tourism and also what tourists. We interviewed 400 locals about this and we interviewed 400 tourists about this. you will almost never see a snow leopard. Almost never see a snow leopard. Now, Tashi's work is an exception to that rule in that he has, in the last couple of years, pioneered high quality tourism with very small numbers of individuals. He's maybe taking 2 to 6 people in a particular time window, usually February and March at the end of winter, when the snow leopards have come down from the high pastures. So they're down about 3,500 to 4,000 meters instead of 4,500 to 5,000 meters. And they're easier to track in the snow as well. And he's found that he can run small snow leopard tourism trails at that time of year. But let's say he's doing that at the minute with 20 people a year out of 100,000. So this is the problem with cryptic cat species. Not prides of lions in the Serengeti, or even leopards and cheetah, although I've never seen a leopard either. I've seen lion and I've seen cheetah. But cryptic cat species in either rugged or forested landscapes, it is extremely difficult to do that sort of tourism because it's difficult to spot solitary cats. But if you're in a mountainous environment, it makes it harder logistically. And if you're in a forested landscape, which lynx are going to be, I mean, there could be a lynx 3 meters away, and if that lynx doesn't want you to see it, you're not seeing that lynx. Mm-hmm. You really aren't.
That's their entire thing, right? That's their entire thing. They're cryptic. They're hiding. They don't want you to see them. It's the entire thing is wired around that.
Yeah. So when we come to think about those lessons and take them to Britain and Ireland, as we discuss the potential for lynx tourism, we do need a reality check, and we need, I think, to be careful of tourism being presented as a panacea that is going to create huge numbers of jobs. It will create some jobs. Lynx could be the brand for the Scottish Highlands and for the Kielder forests, southern Galloway forested belt. That's the other big subpopulation that's being discussed. But very few tourists will ever see lynx. They can go check camera traps. They can pay a conservation surcharge to support the compensation of farmers whenever lynx eat sheep. All those sort of things. We can make those great connections, and we should. But it's going to be really hard to see lynx.
How the snow leopards are doing right now? The population is increasing? Are they doing good? Are they doing well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a story here. You were talking about the commodification, the dangers of commodifying species, which is a valid point to raise. And there's a story here from my dabbling in the conservation world, or snow leopard conservation world, which I think indicates some of the tensions. And hopefully it won't be more NGO bashing, which it's not intended to be. But it's that snow leopards, again, because of their cryptic nature and this vast landscape of 2 million square kilometers, that's 8 times the size of the UK over 12 countries. It's really hard to count them accurately. And there is always, if you look at the estimate for the tiger population, the margin for error is quite small relative to the number of tigers. But when you look at the margin of error for snow leopard population, it's usually up to twice. So it could be between 3.5 to 7. It's creating that margin of error because it has been so difficult to accurately estimate the numbers. Now, over the last 8 years, there has been work by lots of NGOs and stakeholders to try and standardize the survey methods that are used to estimate the population. And snow leopards seem to be doing okay. And again, to compare them to tigers, the problem with tiger habitat, which tiger numbers plummeted from 100,000 100 years ago, roughly, to I think a low of around 3,000. But tiger habitat is prime real estate in the world's most densely inhabited continent. You're talking about lowlands that can be turned into rice paddies and palm oil plantations. The greatest asset for snow leopards, or the greatest protection, is that they inhabit these really remote, high altitude and uninhabitable places. And where they can be inhabited by people, the productivity is so low that only nomadic pastoralism is the way to eke out a living, and then again at very low densities. So that vastness of Central Asia, that remoteness, protects snow leopard habitat to quite a large extent. But I was at a snow leopard conference about 8 years ago where there was a great disagreement over the fact that the snow leopard had actually been downgraded through the IUCN Red List assessment from endangered to vulnerable. And that was because that assessment tools were becoming more accurate, and the evidence was pointing that actually there may be more snow leopards than we thought. Now, that is the goal of conservation. We want every endangered species to be downgraded to vulnerable, because that means conservation was working, right? But there was an almighty dust-up that I had a front row seat to between some of the individuals and organizations involved over what that would mean for the funding for snow leopard conservation if it were downgraded. Because if we're selling snow leopard conservation and raising conservation donations based on a high degree of threat to the species, what would that mean for those donations if we said, well, hold on, snow leopards are actually doing better than we thought because there's more of them than we thought, and no one's ever going to pave Himalayan paradise and put up a parking lot because they'll just get altitude sickness and die. So again, there's always these sort of dynamics going on in the conservation world. Money is always there, power is always there, and that's because conservation is a social process. It's something that we do. It is not just the unfolding of the laws of nature. It is that in some ways, but it is also the unfolding of the laws of human nature.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, so I just want to touch on one other thing. You mentioned in a film or argue that to really be successful at these projects, we need to harness not also science, the hard science, but also spirituality, like the full spectrum of human knowledge or human being, what we are as humans. Can you give a, I don't know, example or maybe elaborate on that, how this the spiritual aspect or not so, hard science, these are the numbers, is helpful and why we need to use it?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, being a critical social scientist, I'm going to give you some complexity and I'm going to give you some nuance. I'm not going to spin fairy tales where...
Bring it on.
You know how it is. It's the real world.
Yeah.
It's not a fairy tale.
That's what we do in this podcast.
Good. Well, then you'll really appreciate this story. And that is, snow leopards, again, are a really interesting species to look at because of the overlap between snow leopards as a species and Tibetan Buddhism. And the overlap, the percentage habitat overlap across large parts of China. So about 60% of snow leopard population and habitat is across Western China. So historically, that would have been a stronghold of Tibetan Buddhism, even despite the persecution often of Tibetan Buddhists by the Chinese Communist Party. But that overlap has been studied and it's just been pointed out, and that Buddhism as a religion would tend to be open to compassion to different species and have, I think it's fair to say, perhaps a stronger environmental and conservation ethic in general than some of the monotheistic faiths. I think that's probably fair to say. And when I did my fieldwork, I was really interested to actually test that in terms of the beliefs and attitudes of individuals in the Annapurna region where the film is set, but also in the Everest region. And what I actually found out, so most of the people who live there are Buddhist, but there are also some Hindus and people of other religions, small number of Christians. Nepal is just a melting pot of different cultures because it's where South and Central Asia meet. And what I actually found that was that Buddhists were actually less positive to snow leopards at both sites. And you can't rewrite the entire history book based on one study, but another person working in India at the time looked at the difference between attitudes to snow leopards between Buddhist and Muslim communities, because that Ladakh and Kashmir would be, you would have Islamic and Buddhist and Hindu cultures all meeting and mixing again, a beautiful and amazing part of the world. And they also found that Buddhist communities were less positive to snow leopards than Muslim communities. So again, there's nuance and complexity here, Tommy, but I think in any culture, in any context, including in our countries, in Britain and also in Ireland, where we are increasingly post-Christian and secular, there is a need to acknowledge that we do not live by numbers alone. We also live by words. We live not just by facts, but by feelings, not just by science and stories. And for many people in the world, I think 80% plus, some sort of religion is an important way that they make sense of the world and give meaning to themselves and their role in this beautiful planet. And I think that the threats to nature are so great that we cannot not reach out to and involve religious communities and religious leaders in terms of action on nature and conservation, and also on climate. So there is, again, for us here, much to be learned from the roof of the world and snow leopard conservation.
For sure. And as they say, when the emotion meets logic, emotion wins 99% of the time. Jonny, just to finish off this conversation, you mentioned at the end of the film that the next chapter is still to be written. What do we need to do so it has a happy ending? Or what you would like our listeners and viewers to take from your report, your book, and your film to ensure that this next chapter has a happy ending? And before you answer, I know there's a complexity in you, as in not every person's happy ending is the same as the other one.
Indeed, very well put. Well, to answer that in two different ways, the next chapter of this film, I hope, is that at some point, I've been working on this short film now for 5 years. It was a COVID baby, and that I was bored in COVID and just thinking of the future. And I was watching a documentary about some 20-somethings hiking through Patagonia, and I thought, I could do that with. And then I reached out to Rinzin again, and we started talking, and I also then. We came up with a concept note. We spent about 18 months trying to get production companies to listen to us. Most of them ignored us. So then I set up my own production company. We decided to do it ourselves. This film is the result, but this is just the next chapter. I would like us to make either a full feature or a series at some point. So stay tuned to the silver screen, because you never know where this is going to go in the next 5 years, say, who knows. But as it pertains to Ireland, and to Britain, and to the growing chorus of calls for the reintroduction of lynx now, and probably in the future wolves in some format, I think a couple of things have happened in the last couple of months that add to the previous discussions that will just help us think about where this is going. One is that Scotland had a national consultation on lynx reintroductions, and they looked at all aspects of reintroductions and coexistence from the perspectives of all stakeholders. Really good report. One of the things that came out of that was, one of the main recommendations was the long-term funding of coexistence. And I'm doing some work now with colleagues on thinking about coexistence trust funds, so financial endowments for reintroduction projects and landscapes, to make sure that the money for coexistence is always there. If governments change, the money's there. If policies change, the money is there. And it's managed by different stakeholders so that they all have skin in the game. And farmers have a say, and reintroducers have a say, and hunters and tourism entrepreneurs and local community leaders have a say. And many of the things that came out of the consultation are similar to the sort of things that I was talking about in the book. And that's good to see on any subject. When you have multiple sources, you triangulate multiple sources, and they're all saying, we need more consultation, we need more long-term planning. That's a sign that we should listen and take this on board. The other interesting thing is a recent study from Northern England and Southern Scotland about from the lynx reintroduction project there, that did a fairly in-depth study of attitudes, and it showed quite high levels of support for lynx reintroductions. I think in some cases up to 70% of people living in the potential reintroduction landscapes. Now, there's a couple of caveats with that. There was an element of peer review, and they acknowledged that studies like that sometimes capture extreme, more pro and more against, as opposed to the many who are somewhere in between. But if you take those results, it would suggest that perhaps attitudes are starting to creep up and becoming more favorable. Although I would recommend that in reintroduction landscapes, that it shouldn't be the reintroduction project that is assessing those attitudes, because there's a danger of confirmation bias where they get the answers that they want to hear. I would like to see independent assessments of attitudes being carried out to remove that bias. It's also better for the project, because if the results are the same, you can say that was done independently by people who hadn't any skin in the game. And the third interesting development before I finish is that I've just collected data from 4,200 10 and 11-year-olds in Northern Ireland and 1,000 16-year-olds. And I asked them about lynx and wolf reintroductions across the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And the two biggest, it was a 5-point Likert scale. So from strongly agree to strongly disagree, that's a very common social science tool. The two biggest categories were neither agree nor disagree, or don't know, which suggests that younger generations, like older generations, there is a broad range of perspectives and a lot of people who are just not sure. There were more children and young people who were supportive of lynx reintroductions than wolf, which makes sense. But there were also more children and young people who weren't sure about lynx because to many the species is still a deodorant or an aftershave and not a pointy-eared cat. So that is a long-winded way to say that the next chapter in the story requires us to more fully understand the nuance of our engagement with these species, with their potential return, and with each other's role in facilitating and opposing this. And yet, I'm not sure there will be a single happy ending because we all tell stories in different ways. There are likely to be many strands of this story woven together. But the next chapter, either way, is still to be written.
Jonny, thank you for that. And folks, Snow Leopard Trail, the short film, and you can track what's going on with everything in conservation as well as Jonny's work by subscribing to my newsletter. I'm sure we're going to talk again. Newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. The link in the description of the show. As usual, go into the description of the show. All the links and resources that you might need from this episode are going to be there. Jonny, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tommy.
Before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.